you know that we are recording this session and will be available at HHI's YouTube channel, and we'll be sharing the link with all of the attendees today. Yeah, so welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We'll discuss topics related to negotiations with non-state actors. My name is Luciana Wozniak, and I'm the program coordinator for the Executive Negotiation Program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. The ENP program, that's how we will be referring to it, is a professional development program in humanitarian negotiation and engagement for humanitarian practitioners. We run a series of training workshops, both online and in various regional locations. Those workshops are called Foundational Frameworks in Humanitarian Negotiation. But we've also been running this webinar series to discuss topics of critical importance for practitioners and that come across during our workshops. And today we're very lucky to have 5 outstanding panelists joining us to discuss tools and approaches in negotiation with non-state actors. And I'll introduce you to them in a moment, but before I start, I just want to remind everyone to please submit questions through the presentation, throughout the presentation through the Q&A box. We've received a few questions already, but feel free to send your questions there, and we hope to have time at the end to address at least a couple of them. So we have a great panelist lineup for today, like I said. And we'll start with Dr. Annette Adler. Annette is the director of the Global Security Program at Pembroke College, where she's also Senior Research Fellow, and at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford, where she also teaches on global security and transnational organized crime. She's also Senior Research Associate at Oxford University's Department of Politics and International Relations. Her work focuses on global security in the contemporary world. She studies evolving security dynamics in the context of armed conflict and the global illicit economy, transitions from war to peace and state responses to insecurity. And then after that, we have Dr. Ezequiel Hafez. Dr. Hafez is a senior policy and legal advisor at Geneva Call, a humanitarian NGO that promotes respect of humanitarian norms by armed groups and de facto authorities. He holds a PhD from the University of Leiden and an LLM and IHL in human rights from the Geneva Academy and a law degree from the University of Buenos Aires School of Law. Prior to joining Geneva Call, he worked for the ICRC in Colombia, Afghanistan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. He has participated in different research projects and has widely published on different international legal issues. Following him, we have Melody Knight. Melody is the Global Humanitarian Access Advisor for the NRC USA and is responsible for managing global projects aimed at improving humanitarian access through policy development, research, advocacy, and capacity building for frontline humanitarian aid workers. Melody has more than 10 years experience in the international nonprofit sector, and in her 7 years with the NRC, she has conducted field missions to its offices in Bangladesh, Iraq, Jordan, Kenya, Myanmar, and Somalia. Following, we have Dr. Sunisa Vukovic. He is a senior lecturer of conflict management and global policy and the director of the Masters of Arts in Global Policy at Johns Hopkins University. He's also a visiting professor at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs, Leiden University. His research focuses on various forms of international conflict resolution, negotiation, and mediation. And he has published in a range of scholarly journals, such as the Journal of Peace Research, Cooperation and Conflict, Global Policy, Washington Quarterly, and the Swiss Political Science Review. And then lastly, Sandra Lubizuto. Sandra is currently serving as Humanitarian Access Specialist in the Humanitarian Principles and Access Unit of the World Food Programme. She has an extensive experience in direct engagement and negotiation with non-state armed groups in Africa, Middle East, and Central America to enable humanitarian organizations to maintain their presence and activities. Her prior professional experience also includes 15 years of directing emergency relief programs for international humanitarian organizations. She lectures regularly on defense, security, and crisis management in complex setups and master courses at the Institute of Strategic and International Relations. And just to note that this is an abbreviated bio of our panelists, and I would encourage you to look them up, and you can see the amazing work they are doing. And also in the invitation we sent you, we have their full bios for you to read and get to know their work a little bit more. And today we're lucky to hear from them. So we are going to frame this webinar as a questions and answers. So I will present a few framing questions for our panelists, and they will give their input for us, and we'll have some follow-up questions as well. And like you've received in our invitation, we are discussing today tools and approaches for negotiation with non-state armed actors. And considering that the rise of interstate conflicts over the course of recent decades has led to an array of challenges and dilemmas for humanitarian actors, particularly for national staff. Efforts to implement humanitarian assistance and protection programming are continually impeded by insecurity, access restrictions imposed by state and non-state actors, including their armed opposition groups, pro-government militias, and criminal organizations. And they need to engage with armed groups and local communities that may lack familiarity or are overtly express hostility towards international humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles. So while humanitarian agencies have worked toward enhancing staff leadership and negotiation capacity to operate effectively in these environments, humanitarian actors continue to struggle in their engagement with non-state actors, particularly those who do not appear receptive or who seem to reject the basic tenets of humanitarian action. So now throwing it to our panelists. We would love to hear from you some of your thoughts on the biggest challenges and dilemmas that humanitarians professionals face when engaging with non-state actors today. And if you could please share your thoughts on some of the effective engagement, what you think an effective engagement with non-state armed actors look like today. If you can touch on some of the core elements of an effective engagement strategy with such groups. And we'll start that with Annette. The floor is yours.
Right, thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation, and also thanks for everyone who's here with us today. Well, I think first of all, to understand the challenges, we need to really look at the three trends that we see when we think about security today. And the first one is that these non-state actors, non-state armed groups in particular, they are increasingly operating at the transnational level. So for example, with our conflict platform project at the University of Oxford, we produce visualizations of conflict events that show how those groups are operating across borders. Think, for example, about Boko Haram that has operated not only in Nigeria, but also Chad and Niger, or Al-Shabaab that not only operates in Somalia, but has also operated in Ethiopia and Kenya. So that's a challenge because our responses are still very much framed in line with states. The second trend is a proliferation of groups. We know, for example, that more new armed groups have formed within the past 6 years or so than in the past 6 decades together. So that sheer amount of different types of groups makes it harder to understand how they operate and how we should respond. And then the third trend is that these groups are increasingly interconnected, and not just the same types of groups, but really also different types of groups. For example, human traffickers subcontract computer hackers, or rebels work together with drug cartels. So there's a mix. These groups do not operate in silo, and that means that the contemporary security landscape is really characterized by this very heterogeneous mix of groups, including in conflicts that are most of the time by now multi-actor conflicts, not just a group against a government. Now, what does it mean then in terms of the responses? Well, first of all, we need to understand that these groups interact with each other in a very dynamic way. So the constellations of groups can change very quickly, the ways in which they cooperate, the ways in which they form alliances, That's, for example, something that lies at the core of our work at the Global Security Program. And of course, when they interact, that has then distinct repercussions on the local population. That's something that I've studied in a book, Borderland Battles, where I was on the ground in Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, to see how those groups interact, how it changes, and what it means for the local population. Now, in terms of the responses then, most of the time we still think about the drivers of conflict, which of course are important, and the root causes, but we don't think so much about what drives the behavior of groups.
I think we lost
understanding.
Oh, okay, come back. Well, you paused just for a second there.
Can you hear me? Can you?
Now we can. Back? Yeah, we just paused. Yeah, we just paused. So if you want to just maybe backtrack just a little bit.
Right. So I was saying that it's crucial to understand not just the drivers of why groups fight in the first place, but also how and why they cooperate with each other in a particular moment of time. So that means for our responses that we need to analyze those interactions, the motifs for cooperation of groups, which often is not in line with their raison d'etre. So you can have ideologically opposed groups, for example, left-wing rebels and right-wing paramilitaries, and they cooperate in order to strike business deals, in order to achieve an income source. And one way of making our engagement more effective is understanding that difference between the drivers of conflicts on the one hand, and then the drivers of the particular behavior of groups in a specific moment in time. And that, because of what I mentioned at the beginning, this increasing interconnectedness of different types of armed group that is very dynamic and very fluid. And perhaps I'll leave it here for now. Thanks.
Thank you. That's very illuminating, and we'll go back to especially the cooperation. I think that's a very interesting thing you brought up, and hopefully we'll go back to that later on. So Ezekiel, want to jump in next?
Yeah, thank you very much, Luciana, and the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative for the invitation for having Geneva call today. As you said, you know, we are an NGO. We've been engaging with armed groups on humanitarian issues for more than 20 years. So just to share a few thoughts on the questions that I think complement what Annette just mentioned. The first thing that I would like to highlight is that, I mean, the question assumes that actually that humanitarian actors, that they want to engage with armed groups, right? So, and there is this assumption that, and then what derives from that question is, okay, why do we want to engage with those actors? We want to engage those actors to access the civilian population living in the territories they control, to raise allegations of violations of humanitarian norms, to distribute vaccines for certain people, to pass a checkpoint, to go through a checkpoint. I mean, and what type of engagement do we actually have? So that's kind of the first reflection that I would like to share. I mean, for us, for instance, it's an engagement towards increasing the protection of individuals and increasing the respect of humanitarian norms. A few of the challenges that I can mention. The first one is, of course, there are very different non-state armed groups around the world. I mean, some have a vertical structure, some have a more horizontal authority, distributed authority, some are community embedded. So for humanitarian actors, when trying to engage with these different armed groups, you know, we have to understand actually how they are organized, how for instance, the command and control works, whether when you're negotiating with someone who is at a checkpoint has the authority to let you in, or you have to talk to someone else. So understanding the organizational structure is one of the important aspects of engagement with armed groups. Having said that, non-state armed groups are dynamic entities. You know, if we think about, for instance, the FARC that concluded the peace agreement in 2016, not the dissident parts right now, is very different to the FARC that operated in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, than to the one that signed the peace agreement in 2016. So, you know, armed groups change. I mean, the lifespan of armed groups is much longer now than what we could think from a theoretical perspective. So when we try to engage non-state armed groups, these changes in their perhaps organizational structure, but also their attitudes with respect to humanitarian engagement should also be considered. The second point that I think is complementary to what Annette mentioned is that non-state armed groups do not act in isolation. So she mentioned the relation between non-state armed groups themselves. I would like to add that non-state armed groups, they interact with community leaders, with religious leaders, with third states, with territorial states, with other groups, with humanitarian organizations, with or other types of organizations, with business companies that are trying to get into the territories they control. So those interactions, they shape the behaviors of non-state armed groups, and they shape the responses that they may have towards the humanitarian sector as well. The third point that I would like to share is that when we think about how non-state armed groups operate, and having taken into account that they are dynamic entities, the other thing is that they do not have the same perspective with respect, for instance, to every thematic issue when we deal with humanitarian issues. So they could have a perspective with respect to child protection and child recruitment and use, another one with respect to humanitarian access, another one with respect to healthcare, another one with respect to protection of civilians. I've been in touch with non-state armed groups that they have a very specific interpretation of what the notion of civilian means, or the notion of humanitarian access or humanitarian principles. And so they have their own specificities and particularities that are conditioned by the environment in which they operate. And this is something that also should be acknowledged, because there are some entry points for humanitarian actors that can be, I would say, more easily rely on than others. Certain armed groups, they don't want to talk about certain issues, while other thematic areas might be, more open for discussion. But the point that I wanted to highlight, taking that into account, is that when we see how they operate, I would say that there are two ways of understanding their activities. And with this, I finished my 5 minutes. The first one is from their ways of thinking about non-state armed groups from a, I would say, rational and collective perspective, and the other one that is more emotional and individual. So from a rational and collective, yes, we think that the organizational structures of the armed group determines the way that they operate, and determines the policies that they adopt, the codes of conduct that they adopt, the relations with humanitarian actors. But there are also emotional ways of understanding the individual behavior of the fighters. When you're talking to, I have been in contact with some groups that they explain to me why they respect or they don't respect certain rules of humanitarian norms, not from a rational perspective, but these experiences that they were sharing actually were based on past experiences, past situations that they had faced. So just to give you a clear example, once I was talking to a group and I said, okay, if you how would you treat an enemy who's detained, an enemy wounded? Would you treat that individual first? That person told me, well, replied that they wouldn't treat that individual very well, because when they had been detained, they were not treated well by the other side. So that was not a rational way of understanding compliance. It was mostly an emotional response to a past experience. So again, just a few thoughts from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ezequiel. Yeah, that point about the emotional reasons, I think is a very important one. Thanks for bringing that up. Melody, we'll pass on to you now, if that's okay.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Melody, and I work for the Norwegian Refugee Council. We're an independent humanitarian organization operating in 35 countries, mostly conflict-affected or displacement-affected scenarios. So a lot of the comments I'll be making today are very operational, and they deal with our engagement with non-state armed groups when it comes to discussing the terms of the provision of humanitarian assistance, like food, water, shelter, education, items like this. So I'll just pick off on what my colleague from Geneva Call just mentioned and chat a bit about some of the very operational constraints and challenges we face when we're dealing with non-state armed groups. So with respect to the hierarchy and the lack of necessarily a clear command and control of non-state armed groups, that often leads to, time-consuming needs to rebuild relationships, It can have impacts for staff security. We often see that there are, bureaucratic and administrative impediments coming not just from the government, but also from non-state armed groups, having to share our grant documentation with both sides, having pressure then for restrictions to movement, implications for recruitment, pressure for taxation. But oftentimes when we're engaging with non-state armed groups, the interlocutor is also, has technical expertise in a subject matter relevant to our work. So they may be a Ministry of Health or have been a Ministry of Health in another form of their leadership. So in terms of that, there's a lot of thinking we have to do with when we're engaging with some of the non-state armed groups, because in the future, they may become legitimate authorities of the areas or the states where we operate. So we need to be conscious of the evolving scenarios and the compromises and the negotiations that we're taking. We can also face some, reputational risks and some pressure perhaps from the government, retaliation for engaging with their adversaries. So these are just some of the kind of more practical things that affect our security and our operations at a day-to-day level. And then your second question about what an effective engagement looks like. I think the important part of that being an open communication and dialogue is having proactive contact, not just reactive. So some of the engagements that we see between operational humanitarian organizations and non-state armed groups, the engagement commences after an incident. And really you see a more conducive and enriching relationship when you're able to meet and discuss the terms of your work together prior to having an incident, and that being the introduction of the two organizations. So some qualities of what an effective engagement might look like is being able to say no without retaliation or impacts on security or operations, staff being able to move freely or limited interference in our principled service delivery, or when we find non-state armed groups are open to learning more about humanitarian principles, about our operations, about protection of civilian responsibilities. So that's just a bit of some of the operational constraints that we face, and I will pass it along. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody. Sunisa, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much. In preparation for this talk, I've tried to anticipate what may be the emphasis of my co-panelists. So I'll try to take a different angle with a list of a few key points I think that anyone preparing for an engagement of this kind needs to keep in mind. So it's like a list of suggestions that I can a list of suggestions that I would suggest. First off, I think that anyone engaging in the practice of negotiating with such actors needs to understand how to properly design the process. So process design remains crucial and the most elusive aspect of engagement. To make the process design most effective, one needs to keep in mind that everything starts with a good diagnosis of the situation on the ground, and acknowledging and embracing in some manner the biases that we all carry when we approach a certain situation is of crucial importance to understand how it will translate into our activities. From diagnosis comes the formula, meaning what our expectations and what our propositions actually are trying to emulate. And then comes the detail. So the diagnosis formula detail approach is of crucial importance to keep in mind whenever engaging in such activities. If we think that we have a template, if we think that we have a blueprint that can be followed and can be easily translated from one context to another, I think that my co-panelists can speak highly about the perils of such approaches. So this is one thing to first and foremost to keep in mind. Second is to understand the limits and the scope of the mandate of humanitarian actors when they engage. Yes, everyone wants to bring peace around the world. Even Miss Universe wants to do that. But at the bottom of our engagement is the mandate that tasks us with a specific expectation that we're trying to achieve. So understanding the mandate and being somewhat transparent with the local stakeholders about the mandate and what they can expect from us when we engage is, I think, an overlooked aspect in humanitarian engagement on the ground. Third would be the feasibility assessment. In fact, I think this is something that oftentimes is taken for granted, meaning that we do not take a moment to see how engageable are the non-state actors, especially armed non-state actors at a specific stage. Their engageability depends on their ability to articulate a political platform that can actually be negotiated on. If they do not have one, forcing them into a negotiation process may actually backfire and reduce the appeal of negotiations on the long term. Fourth, and related to the third one, would be the timing of such initiatives, whether or not the moment, theoretically, as we like to call it, is ripe. If the conditions permit for an effective peacemaking process. Oftentimes in analysis, we tend to think that the right moment is related to the battlefield conditions and the situation of hurt and pain that the parties experience, and they want to exit such predicament. But in fact, as recent research is showing, it's more about the gain that the parties are looking at, whether or not the offers at the table or propositions from the outside actors are sufficiently enticing for the parties to change their ways and move in a different direction than what their current status is. I think the case study of FARC is very telling on that end. Now, when it comes to, and fifth, if I may just kind of point on that, is to understand the value of power that all of these actors have on the local level. And that there is one very maybe counterintuitive proposition that one can keep in mind, that is power symmetries on the ground actually are detrimental to an effective negotiation process. We need to embrace that power is fluid and power changes over time, and that the impact of humanitarian actors is to change the perceptions about the feasibility of the status quo for the parties, meaning that they may not feel as comfortable as they are if they continue with what they're doing. So shaking the foundations of power symmetries and moving them into perceiving that their detriment is in the making is something that humanitarian actors oftentimes try to avoid, but it's actually something that creates a right moment on the ground. In practice, I think on an operational level, so if I can just kind of conclude with that, I think one of the biggest challenge for all humanitarian actors is to achieve effective cooperation and coordination of their activities. These two are complementary efforts. They're not identical. Cooperation implies compatibility of interest. Coordination implies a mechanism by which they achieve cooperation. Understanding where there is convergence of interest is of crucial importance. Oftentimes we take for granted that all NGOs share a vision. They don't. They share an emphasis. They don't. They actually compete. And as such, that competition may translate into a lack of cooperation that may be detrimental to the full peacemaking process. So designing a coordination mechanism around that competition is actually one of the biggest challenges in contemporary peacemaking. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those remarks. And then Sandra, I'll pass on to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy to be here today with everyone who's joined online. My colleagues and my peers have said a lot, so I'm going to try not to repeat on the combination of persistent challenges in engaging with non-state armed group. What I would like to say is that this is possible with every, like any kind of armed group. This is possible and this is happening, and that we think that every day humanitarian organization engaging and negotiating with armed groups. In addition to the challenges that were mentioned, and maybe is the perception of non-state armed group on humanitarian assistance and humanitarian actors. We have lost the cards of the good guy, and we are perceived differently. We need to show efficiency. They are suspicious of us. We might be perceived as non-neutral, supporting local government or Western agenda, neo-colonialist, inefficient, corrupted, etc. So that we need to be conscious when we are engaging with some armed groups. We've seen lately also some group that benefit some. They are very advanced in their communication capacities, using social media, mis and disinformation to protect or advance their interests. And that's also a challenge when we are engaging with them, as they can market humanitarian activity for their own benefit or to legitimize their presence. A practical issue is the challenge, as my colleagues from NRC mentioned, the restriction that from sanction, from unilateral coercive measures, or from national decrees to go to those places where armed groups are operating or have some influence on the population. That makes the engagement more difficult as well, because you need to find proxy that may convey your message differently or has their own bias. But also you need more time to build trust, and sometimes as well it's difficult to have the nuance when you are not face to face. And finally, in the challenging in engaging with non-state armed group, I would say is the different level of negotiation agreement that or a negotiation engagement that we have today. So we have very high level negotiation that are done in headquarters, New York, Geneva, capital of member states, etc. But then when it comes to the implementation of the agreements in the field, the message might not have been conveyed to the combatant, to the guys at the checkpoint. And then the challenges of making sure that when you have reached an agreement, the implementation of this agreement is done timely and effectively to build that trust and confidence is challenged. So that's for the challenge. And for the second question on effective engagement with armed group, as Sunisa just mentioned, I think preparation is key. There is an whole process that the teams needs to prepare. And it doesn't take, just to add and not to repeat, it doesn't take one person to engage. It takes a whole team to engage. It takes people who have the capacity to analyze the situation. It takes logistics, finance, and programs to make sure that the agreement is implemented. So that's what I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You gave us so much to unpack, and I wish we had 3 hours because I would like to comment on a lot of your points, but we have to continue. So thank you so much for all of your initial remarks. So maybe we can move on now with some questions and try to give our participants some concrete advice on moving forward in their negotiations or when they are engaging. And I will start with a question for Sandra and Melody on negotiations for humanitarian access. More specifically, it's one of the central questions in humanitarian negotiation discussions today. And would love to hear from you. How do you approach and lead engagements in a principled and ethical way, negotiations specifically for access? And Sandra and Melody, for both of you.
Okay, I'll start. It's a great question, and I think one of the things that we must keep in mind when we're negotiating for access is to sort of be very predictable in our adherence to the principles and how we interpret them as our organization and in our operations. And so that goes back to what both of the colleagues previously said about planning. And when you're preparing for a negotiation, you're considering all the potential risks and the criticality of the programming you're about to do, but you're also considering what you're willing to accept in terms of the impact that the environment may have on the principled adherence to your programming. So what I mean by that is getting the group together that will be conducting the programming and discussing with them, okay, this is our red line. This is what we prefer. This is what we would tolerate. And this means we have to stop the operation. And making sure that all staff are involved in that conversation and that they're all prepared to understand those and to articulate those, and knowing that entering a negotiation will help everyone adhere to the principles when they're planning the programming. So it's important that we remember that it's incumbent upon us to describe the principles, and we need to be able to understand from the driver to the head of the organization how we're adhering to those when we conduct our programming. And another thing to consider is sort of the timeline, the risks that you might be taking. Do you need to discuss this with the community? Should you be discussing this with your donor? Are there impacts that you'll see with the community preferring to conduct the negotiation with the non-state armed group themselves? Do we need to take that into consideration? So there's a lot that we can do at the outset of entering a new program that will help us to keep a principled relationship when we're negotiating for access.
Thank you. You said most of it, but I would like just to add maybe that when we engage with non-state armed groups, as it was mentioned before, some of them are really aware of the principles. There was this excellent report from the colleagues from Geneva Call a few years ago, I think it was In Their Eyes, that were like providing example on how members of non-state armed group might have worked for humanitarian organizations before and are very aware of their entitlement, how we operate the modality. And I would like to say, when we frame the negotiation, we're not coming with the Geneva Convention. We're not arriving there with the principle. What we try to find is common ground around those principles that could raise their interest as well and allow them to leave us to operate in those areas. The other thing is that humanitarian principles also allow us to have something to advocate to influencers, and I think donors, to remind them their role as well, to remind the roles of authorities and non-state armed group as well, but also those people who can influence our negotiation. So what I would like to say is that basically they are tools for action and advocacy to negotiate access to affected population and to find common grounds with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks. Moving on, I have a question now for Sunisa and Annette. And I would love to hear more from you on some specific challenges and dilemmas of engagement with criminal groups, transnational criminal groups. What kind of similarities and difference could contribute to humanitarians' understanding of that kind of interaction, especially when we consider that many of these contexts are outside of armed conflicts where they're not protected by IHL. So yeah, I would love to hear from both of you on that point.
Sure, maybe I can start. I think one particular challenge is the legitimacy issue. It was brought up a little bit already by previous panelists, but especially when it comes to criminal groups, we tend to think about them very differently to rebel groups, insurgent groups. But actually, from the perspective of the local population, they often receive huge support from local communities, and oftentimes they do replace the social contract in a certain way. So the state-society relationship, what we see instead is something that I call in my research shadow citizenship. So the governance provider is not the state, but it is the criminal group. They provide services. They are involved even in conflict resolution and justice in return for certain consent. And although, of course, the line between the consent out of respect and out of fear is often blurred. So that then means that for them, when the state comes in, when external actors come in, they are not necessarily the good guys helping the local communities. They are often perceived to be the bad guys, taking away the protection even that local communities might have from them. And one part here is especially the provision of economic opportunities in places where we do not have legal economic opportunities. It is often the illicit economy that provides livelihoods for local populations. That's people who are involved even just in small scale trafficking and contraband. But if we look at this from a moral economy perspective, perhaps rather than political economy perspectives, we understand that they are so vulnerable, they have no other choice, right? And it's the criminal groups that provide certain opportunities that they might not have otherwise. So it's a pragmatic choice oftentimes by the local community. And that, of course, is then very similar also to what we see in the context of other armed groups insertions. So just to give you one example, it was mentioned before that the case study of the FARC in Colombia. I've interacted with communities quite a lot, both before the peace agreement and after the peace agreement. And one example after the peace agreement was that local community members would tell me if they have a problem in terms of conflict or justice, they would not go to the police or the military. They would still go back to the demoralization camps to talk to the commanders because they know them so much better. They have more trust. So that's very similar in terms of criminal groups. And I think understanding that there is a legitimacy issue, meaning that we first of all have to gain the local population's trust, is very important and applicable across those different groups.
If I may, I would take a slightly different emphasis to this question. Keeping in mind everything Annette just said, I think we need to be very careful who do we design as a criminal group or criminal gang within a larger spectrum of armed non-state groups. FARC was proscribed as a narco-terrorist group for political reasons and with valid evidence for it. But FARC is way different than MS-13 or Barrio 18 in El Salvador, or an urban gang in Rio de Janeiro. We're talking about a different way to, we need to find a more specific way to assess the differences and variation across these groups in order to understand when they become engageable. And I think legitimacy is a very important starting point, but legitimacy is too complex of a concept and of a framing device to rely only on it. So I would propose two other types of assessment tools. One is the level of representativeness, so not legitimacy in itself, but representativeness for these groups, meaning are they sensitive in any way, responsible and accountable to the local populations that they encircle, dominate, control, move through, however you want to do it. Second is their ideological sharpness or ideological zest. And if you categorize them high and low, you will see that the only type of engageable actors are those ones with high representativeness and low ideology. And all actors can move across the four cells. And criminal gangs, to be criminal gangs, to maintain their low politics of criminality, need to still be categorized within the group of low representativeness, low ideology. That is MS-13, Barrio 18, urban gangs in Rio, et cetera, et cetera. Once they shift, once they assume a higher representativeness or take on a more ideological stand, they change category. And they can move either to become slightly more engageable, because they are more representative, they're more sensitive, as was the case in El Salvador, when they actually negotiated because they grew exponentially when it comes to presence on the local level, or they can actually become more extremist and take a little bit more of a ideological edge to their cause, becoming something of a Baader-Meinhof gang or Red Brigades in Italy or something of a kind. So what I'm trying to say is legitimacy is something that you gain within the negotiation process. So once you become engageable, you are provided with a stamp of approval of an engageable actor. And that is a high political incentive, and it's not given easily. And this is something that I have been providing an answer in the Q&A. But thinking that just because a non-state armed group conducts criminal activities makes them exclusively a criminal group, we neglect the variation within these groups. FARC was acting criminal, ISIS is acting criminal, Al-Qaeda is acting criminal. All of them have a way to extract resources to conduct their fight. But that's not the sole purpose of their existence, as is the case in Mala Salvatrucha and Barrio 18. So I just want to kind of point out a little bit of a variation across the groups that we're talking about.
Great, thank you so much for those remarks. And Sandra, you wanted to jump in and make a comment on that as well?
Yeah, on the challenge for humanitarian organization on those specific groups that are more, for the moment, more localized in Latin and Central America, will say that one of the challenges is the multiplication and the number of those groups in very limited areas. So if we take the city of Port-au-Prince, I think that the latest was 160 groups with 40 very active, some of them controlling very small territories. That means that you have to negotiate in parallel with multiple groups to obtain the authorization just of passage. And it was the same in El Salvador, where you have groups, gangs controlling 5 kilometers of portion of roads on the same road. The power dynamic of those groups also is very volatile. So basically, when you engage with someone, he might be killed or detained or arrested within a few weeks, and you need to restart the whole process. So that's a big challenge.
Thank you. Thank you so much for adding to that. Let me move on to Sunisa would like to. Oh, okay. Okay, so just a question for Ezekiel now. Ezekiel, on a practical level, what is a non-negotiable in principle with non-state armed actors as you conduct the type of engagement that Geneva conducts? And if you can also share like some successful engagement examples and strategies that have led to beneficial protection outcomes for Geneva Call, that would be helpful.
Yes, thank you very much, Luciana. And I think the question was actually asked in the chat box. So thank you. Thanks to the person who also included this there. So in terms of non-negotiable issues, I mean, from a humanitarian standpoint, for us, there are no red flags. I mean, we try to, Geneva Call has a specific thematic areas that we work on. So child protection, sexual violence and gender discrimination, cultural heritage, healthcare, prohibition of starvation, prohibition of forced displacement, humanitarian issues in general. So for us, we try to, when we identify that one of those thematic areas is being affected by the respected armed group or de facto authority, we try to conduct the humanitarian engagement with the respective actor. That humanitarian engagement can include different activities. So can include from bilateral discussions about specific rules of international law or sources that armed group is relying on or is using, such as local sources, religious sources, local costumes, and so on. But also it could entail trainings on international law. It could entail also discussing their code of conduct. Geneva Call has also these deeds of commitment that armed groups sign. We monitor the respect of those commitments. It's sort of unilateral declaration. So just to give you different tools that we use. But for me, the key aspect here that I think is something that has been discussed by the various panelists is that non-state armed groups, again, are dynamic entities. So when we think that non-state armed groups at some point in conflict, they might not be willing to engage in a certain thematic area, that doesn't mean that during the entire conflict, that group is not going to be willing to engage on that specific thematic area. So again, it might happen that suddenly they are negotiating a ceasefire with another group over the state, or with the state they're negotiating the peace agreement, and they might be willing to discuss about the prohibition of using and recruiting children in hostilities, or the issues related to gender equality. So there might be moments in the conflict in which the groups might be more willing to discuss certain issues than others for different reasons. Again, the root causes of armed groups' behaviors differ also according to the specific thematic area. And the last point in terms of successful stories, I would say it's very complicated to define an experience as successful, because there are always ongoing challenges. Yes, of course, Geneva Call has engaged with armed groups on child protection and use, child recruitment and use, and as a result of those engagements, the groups have released children from their ranks, but that doesn't solve all the problems related to child protection in that specific area. Yes, armed groups have signed Geneva Call deeds of commitment. We have gone there. We have monitored the respect of those deeds. We have had bilateral discussions with the group. We have delivered trainings on humanitarian norms. The groups have adopted an internal code of conduct. They have released children. They have, taken measures to protect children in detention, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that problems on child protection are solved in that area. So I think it's very difficult to define something as successful. But I would say that some positive results have been achieved. So armed groups have destroyed their stockpile of anti-personnel mines as a result of our engagement, or they have released children from their ranks, or they have, just a recent experience as a group that had one of its military barracks next to a healthcare facility. And we went there and we discussed with the group the rules on, on conduct of hostilities and how that would entail a problem for the communities living around, if the enemy would come and they would attack that military barrack. And that, after a couple of discussions with that group, then they moved that military barrack away from those civilians' facilities. So again, that's one story. It doesn't solve all the protection problems.
Thank you. We've received many questions that unfortunately we won't be able to address. And I'm going to point it out again here before people start dropping off soon. Please look up the work of our panelists. You can find many publications they worked on, and you can learn more about this, all of these processes by reading their publications, and also at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative website and the ENP program. There are publications you can look it up too, and feel free to email me. You have my email for all the attendees, and I can I can send you links for materials. So I think I have two, if that's okay. I have one question that we received many variations of the same question from the chat. So I'll ask that question from the chat, and then we'll have one question for all of you to wrap up. Does that sound good for everyone? We might go a couple of minutes over here, if that's okay. So we received a few questions on how to carry on negotiation and engagement with non-state armed actors who effectively control civilian populations and are designed under sanctions and counterterrorism measures. So any input on how to balance those challenges, dilemmas, or how to engage with those specific extremist groups under those situations? And I'll open the floor if one of you would like to go first. Melody? No,
sure,
I saw you. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, happy to answer that. I think there's the impacts of counterterror measures on principled humanitarian action are increasing, and it's becoming more of a problem in a sense that it generates exactly what the questioner posed, a lack of certainty, and then what we see is a chilling effect, which ultimately means that some organizations who don't have the legal resources to investigate how they might be able to negotiate with a non-state armed group without violating national law, let's say, or without violating a sanction, they may be disinclined to operate in those areas. So then what we're seeing is a broader unprincipled response, a pattern of response that might be concentrated in areas where there are government and not so-called designated terrorist groups. So a lot of the things that we can do around that is advocacy with our donors, especially creating safe spaces for frank conversations about risk management, about what's going on in these areas, encouraging them to create, laws and work with their governments to have their funding and their support be, licensed and have humanitarian exemptions in a lot of these rules. And then just, I would say, working together and making sure that the organizations there are continuing to advocate for a principled response and high operations in areas where some of these designated groups are operating.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to? Sunisa, please.
Yeah, just to add to what Melody was just saying, I think one opportunity also is in looking for proxies or liaisons or mediators, because not everyone shares the blacklist of who is prescribed as a terrorist organization. So you will always have an entity, a country, a regional body that actually does not agree with the prescription, and they actually might be more willing to engage with those actors. And we have seen this time and time where some usual suspects actually are the ones that would engage when no one else would. If you think about the case of Sri Lanka, Norway would engage with LTT when no one would want to do that. Various organizations affiliated with the Vatican in Latin America would be the proxies, be it Comunità Sant'Egidio or the Vatican itself, that would actually be willing to serve as proxies for those talks, including with criminal gangs, as was the case in El Salvador. So it is a deterrent. It's a political deterrent, but it has never achieved absolute success in preventing engaging with those actors. So I think there's always a backdoor through which one extra agent may be included in the talks to provide further legitimacy, clarity, stability to the process, etc. Just a thought.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to jump in for this one? Sandra? Sandra, and then Ezekiel, and then Annette.
Yeah, yes, very briefly, one of the solutions to overcome the challenges and for the UN organization, I would like to remember is, first of all, that we are following UN sanctions. So, and we find that we have the exemption that we need to operate. However, our partners is not the same. For our partners, it's not the same. And we are very conscious of that. And we are following the great discussion that were led by NRC, ICRC, OCHA on the call for actions and those things. So, but the thing is that the first actors that we need to engage with are the community, the affected community, and the civilians. And they might be the right conveyor in certain occasion and certain context for engagement with armed groups. And we see now in Sahel, communities are directly negotiating with armed groups just for their safety. So they are the one at the front line negotiating their protection, their access to basic services, to their field, to their land, to be able to cultivate, etc. So we can engage, we need to do much more to engage with community, to engage with community-based organization. As Sunisa said, we need to think out of the box, those actors, the community of St. Egidio, the colleagues from Geneva Call, everyone that might have an entry point and can help us to navigate those sanctions, those restrictions of engaging with them.
Ezekiel, you wanted to jump into?
Yeah, I mean, just perhaps two quick thoughts. Of course, counterterrorism legislations are one of the main current challenges for humanitarian actors nowadays. I mean, it's practically in every discussion about, you know, armed conflict. There is, and specifically about non-state armed groups, there are issues that are raised about counterterrorism legislations. Of course, it is obviously a challenge because humanitarian actors interact with these groups on the ground on humanitarian issues. I mean, having said that, I would like to perhaps the question has two elements that I think are relevant. One is in terms of control over the population. That was kind of the first part of the question: how we engage with armed groups that have a control over a certain number of people and that are listed in counterterrorism lists. Of course, nowadays we have millions of people living under the control of non-state armed groups, and this is something that we often share because these people are some of the points I think were shared before by Annette. I mean, these people, they see those groups as the authority. You know, these people, they continue with their lives as if they were living under state authorities. Most of them, they don't reflect on the differences between states and non-state actors. But the importance of engaging these entities is there. I mean, a clear example is COVID-19. You know, we have had different discussions about access to vaccines in the last few years, and whether, you know, these groups that were controlling millions of people, they could have access to COVID-19 vaccines to distribute in the territories they control. So again, the discussion even resulted in some paragraphs in a UN Security Council resolution last year. But the challenges are still there, and one of the points that was raised before, that we always participate or try to participate, is in advocacy and trying to convey the message that the dialogue that we have with these entities is humanitarian in nature, that it doesn't try to legitimize the goal or the motives of the groups. It simply aims at acknowledging that they have obligations under international humanitarian law and that they have to respect those obligations. So let's have a discussion about those rules, about protecting the civilians on the ground. So that's kind of the importance of the message that we try to convey at the different advocacy events. Thank you.
Maybe I can just quickly build on, especially on Sandra's point and Ezekiel's point. about the importance of communities, and then the other key point is perceptions, and that goes back to what I said earlier about legitimacy. Because on the one hand, I mean, we can analyze them from the outside, right? And we can understand why they are there, but we also know that those labels, it's not just the groups that change, also the labels change, whether they are designated as terrorists, whether they are considered criminal groups, whether they are considered insurgents. But of course, for the local population, there's more of a constant. As Ezekiel mentioned, they are the authority regardless of the label. And ultimately, it's what I said before, it's a pragmatic decision, often just for people to survive, to engage with them in a certain way. And that, of course, then can be also an advantage in terms of this long-term relationship that local communities have had with these actors, whereas outsiders come in and have to basically adhere depending on those labels. So understanding local perceptions and taking advantage of the fact that these perceptions have been established over a long time, regardless of the labels, is crucial to then engage in a little bit more of a creative way.
Thank you very much. Those are great points, and I again recognize we're over time. We have one last question to wrap up, and maybe here now thinking about the future of this field. And my question to you is, how can practitioners better prepare for engagement and considering the challenge that we'll face in the future? And also, how can international agencies promote more inclusive partnerships and collaborations with local partners? You've all mentioned the importance of that interaction. So how can we foster more of an inclusive, equitable partnership and collaboration with local partners for future challenges? And I'll open the floor for whoever wants to start first.
I can start.
Okay,
Aneta, you want to start?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. No, just quick, two quick thoughts on ways forward. I think it is quite important to understand the actors that we're dealing with, to understand the interactions that they have with different entities, local societies, religious leaders, other organizations, other groups, third states, to also engage those entities on humanitarian norms. I think we shouldn't see the armed groups as isolated entities, and if we actually want to achieve protective outcomes, we should engage all the influential entities that are around those groups. And that implies understanding, root causes of behavior, root causes of violations, root causes of restraint, structural issues, individual issues, and so on and so forth. In terms of coordination, I think Sunisa made a fantastic point that is about, coordination with how the humanitarian sector is coordinated on the ground. I mean, of course, we have the protection clusters and we have the meetings that humanitarian actors, we participate on the ground. But, when you think about it from a very pragmatic perspective, if you have to go through a checkpoint and that is controlled by an armed group, and that checkpoint, those individuals, they have seen 10, 15, 20 organizations. We assume that they will know the mandate of the 20 organizations, that they will know what they're doing there, that they will know everything about those organizations. I think we should be conscious that those assumptions might not necessarily be true, and try to better complement each other on the ground. I mean, understanding that we have different mandates, and do not make the assumption that because they have seen us once or twice, they will understand, the differences between a certain organization, UN agency, another entity, and so on. I mean, of course, we might have different emblems and logos, but that doesn't mean that they will know by heart all our mandates and everyone. So I think it's part of the coordination issue that Sunisa mentioned. From a pragmatic perspective, this is very key. Also with local actors, I mean, of course, that's much needed because they have a lot of information about the conflict dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you, Ezekiel. Aneta?
Sure, thanks. I'd like to add here on the interactions that these different groups have, and perhaps focus a little bit more on how important context analysis is. That's what we are doing also at Oxford at the Global Security Program. So what I said at the very beginning, we see that there is more interaction also across different groups, and there are more groups involved in a particular setting. We can't just look at one group in isolation, and that of course has implications then also for the security of communities on the ground. So for example, when different groups are fighting each other, yes, then we need to think about the protection of civilians. but often they have these very subtle illicit business deals. They have arrangements with each other that are very short-lived, especially in illicit business hubs, in those trafficking nodes where illicit flows converge. And here the challenge is a very different one. It's one of mistrust, because people don't know who's on whose side for how long. So we need to think about how to actually promote social cohesion, how we can make sure that people go out and trust each other. And then there's the third challenge, which is when we might not even see that violence to such an extent, because different groups, different types of groups even, have these long-term arrangements with each other, tacit agreements of non-aggression, or even just strategic alliance. They share intelligence with each other. They operate jointly together. Now that is a very different challenge. Again, it means that often they do establish this shadow citizenship. They do provide services. They are the governance actor. So that's, again, a very different type of challenge, where we need to think about how to promote that trust, and how to also just promote or provide services that are provided by other types of groups. So it's really about understanding what happens when there's not just one individual non-state armed group, but what happens when they all operate at the same time. And those types of interactions are changing very, very quickly. So it's the right context analysis that helps prepare practitioners for better engagement. Thanks.
Thank you. Melody, do you want to jump in next?
Sure. I think when we consider the future of the field and how practitioners are going to be working on engagement with non-state armed groups, I see 3 trends at the very operational field practical level that we can be looking out for. One is this continued influence of counterterror measures on our principled humanitarian action. And when I spoke about that earlier, I forgot to mention that we have a toolkit. So I'm hoping that one of my colleagues can drop that in the chat. That will help our operational partners have the tools ready to engage with their donors and with the communities they're serving and within their staff. So that's going to continue to be a trend, I believe. Another is the point that you raised about engaging with local actors. When we're talking about humanitarian operations and working with local actors, we need to ensure that we're not transferring the risk to our local colleagues. So oftentimes you'll see a large INGO or a UN agency that's operating a lot through local partners. They're then seen in, high-level decision-maker meetings talking about their access around the country. And really what's happening is that they're programming through partners, and those partners are taking on a lot of risk in areas under the control of non-state armed groups. So we want to make sure that when we're enabling and we're fostering equitable partnerships with local actors, that we're really, really conscious of not transferring our risk to them and not just counting on them to deliver services in an area because of the presence of non-state armed groups. And then the third trend that I see in the future of the field is this sort of professionalization of access. So we're seeing, more access working groups, more humanitarian country teams are developing access strategies. We're seeing more, joint operating principles and the recruitment of more access advisors in the field. And we just need to make sure that those are inclusive of the local actors that we were just discussing, that they're represented in those mechanisms and that they're represented in forums where decisions are taking place. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. You want to go next?
Thank you, and hard to add on all what have been said. Maybe for the future of the field, I think there will still work. That's for sure. We need some more capacity. We need some more diversity in the profiles, with languages, with nationality, with ethnic. I mean, we are dealing in areas now where there is no presence of internationals. And whatever we say about the transfer of the risk is national colleagues and national organizations that are now engaging and being at the front line. And for that, we need to make sure that we also build the capacity, provide and share analysis with them. For WFP, we have engaged with the Center of Competence of Humanitarian Negotiation, Kligendal Institute, and various institutes to train our staff in engagement and in negotiation. We also need to go, as it was mentioned, beyond traditional actor when we are thinking about engaging. And I think we are still lacking, and especially with the criminal groups, the all private sector dynamism and spoiler that might be involved in those activities, and that might be something that we need to invest a bit more. And then again, we need to better understand how affected populations navigate the constraints imposed by armed groups, and then to assess them and to better support them on how to deal with all those constraints to access assistance. So no problem. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sunisa, will you close us out, please?
I don't want to take any more time. The only thing that I did not hear, and I think would be of value to keep in mind, is the intercultural training and capacity building to understand the context within which these operations take place. And as Sandra was saying, I really cannot stress this enough, is the capacity building of the staff for effective negotiation and mediation to be done at these professional institutes where professional diplomats are being trained, because you are now the real diplomats more than the formal ones will ever be when it comes to direct engagement with conflict affected populations. So it's of utmost importance to build those skills. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, and thank you for sharing your expertise with all of our attendees today. That's what we are hoping to do here, help build capacity of practitioners. I cannot stress enough how grateful I am to have all of you here, and hopefully we'll be able to do something else to address all of the questions we got and we didn't have time to get to today. So we are well over time. Thank you so much for your generosity and sharing your knowledge and your time. And for our participants, thank you for attending. I wish you all a great rest of your day, and please contact me with any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for hosting this. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Luciana.
Bye, Sandra.